Morning, church. If you have celebrated a silver wedding anniversary, raise your hands. Let's see. All right, thank you. So you know what it's like to be faithful. How about golden wedding anniversary? Whether your spouse is here or not, doesn't matter. If you've celebrated a 50th wedding anniversary, raise your hands. Let's see. Wow, that is amazing. I mean, a few years ago, maybe 50 years ago, that would not have been so amazing, but that's almost like strange in the culture that we live in today. When we think about what it means to be faithful, love begins in a moment, grows over time, and lasts for eternity. God chose to use marriage. He chose to use the family to teach us about faithfulness. But when we look at faithfulness a little bit deeper from Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, we see that faithfulness can mean even more than just that beginning. So how do you see faithfulness? What does it mean to you? And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last, who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say they are Jews, but are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. What does it mean to be faithful? Think about your week, this past week. Did everything go okay? Was there ever a time you were asked to turn the other cheek? Was there ever a time you were asked not to say anything, just to be quiet, just to take it on the chin? Were you almost arrested because you couldn't speak Spanish? Right, Chris? They brought in something through immigration, and Carter, that was close, wasn't it? So I guess you want to learn to speak Spanish, right, before next year? Good idea. But, you know, there's so many things that happen to us in our lives that we get to think, it just ought not to be this way. Why should I have to turn the other cheek? Why should I go that second mile? Why should I give not only my cloak, but also my tunic? Why must I give to them who ask and not withhold from that person who would want to bother? Why does Jesus ask us to live this level of perfection that is so hard? And so if we think about things that have happened, think about losses and deaths and all types of stuff that we have going on in our lives, we realize quickly this is not an easy world to live in. When I say this, I mean it's not easy to be a Christian in this world that we're in. I highlighted some things in this slide. You can see there was the Jews, the synagogue of Satan, and so on. On the second slide, I highlighted the numbers, like first, last in yellow, second death, the number 10. I also highlighted some of the things in green, like we'll have a crown, and if we conquer. I also looked at all the times suffering is mentioned in this short passage. And I see that God's churches, as we learned in Matthew 24 from Jack this morning, had a really rough time. Jack, I imagine you read about persecutions and martyrdoms, and it just curled you. I mean, it's just awful to read that stuff. And I did the same this week. Tribulation, poverty, slander, fear, suffer, tested, tribulation, death, hurt. Some of these is happening to you, but some of these things are about to happen to you. How many of you would love to know if you were about to have a really hard time? How many of you find it easier if it just happens than to know it's about to happen? To know that Jesus is going to die on the cross. It would have been easier if he had not known that than to sweat teardrops of blood. I mean, blood was coming from him. He was perspiring blood in anguish, knowing what he was going to have to face. And so if there's anybody that I could take this advice from, it would be Christ. When I look at this, I see several things just start jumping out at me. I see that there is counsel given, that there is, let me just get to this page here. I'm on the wrong sermon. There we go. That's tonight's sermon. Please come back. We've got another one tonight. There's commendation we need to receive. There's counsel we're going to receive. There's challenges we're going to receive. So go to the next slide and let's look at some of the transition. The word Smyrna also means myrrh. It means something that was anointed on you when you died. And Jesus, after he died, they came to anoint his body with spices. Some of those spices would have been myrrh. But not only was myrrh the word for spices, it was also Smyrna. Of the 7 churches, this was the church that would suffer the most. And when we think about this myrrh, it is also what is used as an ointment, a nice smelling ointment that comes before God. And so you have this ointment, this suffering, this martyrdom, this persecution coming up before God, and to him it smells good. And to you and I, we think, well, we're not martyrs, but maybe I need to explain this word a little bit better to you. The word martyr means witness. In English, the word witness is example. Are you an example of Christ in your life? Are you an example of Christ in your life? If you are, you will understand martyrdom. You will understand suffering. You'll understand people looking at you and saying, I don't know about this. You will do things like take your family vacation to a third world country. And there is some suffering. Also suffering, leaving those people, Chris, was not easy. Leaving some of those relationships, knowing that's my brother in Christ that I've left, knowing the type of lives they are living because of their examples for Christ. And so there's a lot more that goes into this. The key points, as I have mentioned, is look at verse 9. When we receive commendation, look at the counsel, verse 10, and look at the challenge in verse 11. But verse 8 is the transition. And so if you would, look with me, open your Bibles to chapter 2, Revelation chapter 2, verse 8. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna, to the angel, in other words, to the messenger. We would call a messenger today somebody who would get up and preach. But this is a spiritual letter, and so there is a real angelos. The Greek word angel is used here, not just as a messenger, but I believe as an angel that is over this church, that looks at this church that is here in this northern Kentucky area. And to the angel of the church, the collective called out people in Smyrna, a church that is going to, of all the churches, really, really suffer. Right. So now imagine an angel coming to John. He's on the Isle of Patmos, and he's writing to these churches that are just off the Isle of Patmos. The words of the first and the last who died and came to life. Is that what he would have said? John would say, slow down, I'm writing. And so he's writing verbatim what is going on here. The words of the first. Colossians chapter 1 verse 16 says that Jesus would be the firstborn. Not only from God, but also the firstborn out of death. He's also the last. He's everything. He's the Alpha, the Omega. He's the complete of everything that we need. Now, this is the second letter written to the 7 churches of Asia. The first one was to the Ephesians. And the Ephesians, when it came to them, there was condemnation because they'd lost their first love. To this church, there's nothing wrong. They are a perfect, beautiful church. The persecution has taken all the vile things out of them. Sometimes we wonder why we suffer and we don't realize it's because God is presenting something beautiful to us, for God. And so we see this church, and he says to Ephesus, you've lost your first love. Where is Ephesus today? If you look at a map, you'll see that Ephesus is on a sea coastal area, and it's a beautiful place. There's so much ocean transportation that can come to this. But when you look at Smyrna, it's sort of inland. Yet today, Ephesus is ruins. There's nothing going on at Ephesus. But Smyrna is a vibrant, bustling city of 200,000. And so you can see very clearly what happens here when we pay attention to God and what God wants us to do. And so he talks again, the first and the last who died and came to life. Who are we speaking about? Who's the first and last? Who died and came to life? We are reading the words of somebody who died, who walked amongst us, and is now alive. And he's verbatim telling us, this is Jesus Christ. These are his words that he says. He says, receive this commendation. And so if we are going to be a people who will be faithful and true, number one, we must be able to receive commendation. Are you living the type of life to where he can say what he's going to say in verse 9? So read with me verse 9. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. And the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. I know your tribulation. How many of you are struggling today? How many of you, if you knew that someone knew how much you're suffering, that would mean something to you? And here he's saying, I know your suffering. I know your tribulation. I mean, that means a lot to me. I sometimes don't know why I suffer. I sometimes don't know why I have to turn the other cheek. But I know that I have to. I know that I must try to not defend myself. Don't always understand it. But the fact that Jesus knows it, I can go to anybody that's struggling right now, and I can say to this person, brother or sister, Jesus knows your tribulation. He knows how much you're suffering. And your poverty. Now, if you look up here, you'll see from James chapter 2, verse 5, that we are actually very rich. You know, he says, listen to me, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs and the promise and all these things? And we are rich when we look at how he looks at things. But you are rich. And the slander. Sometimes persecution doesn't come from outside. These people were being persecuted from the Gentiles who were against Christianity, from the Jews who were against Christianity. They were being persecuted from every area you can imagine. They were being ostracized because they're Christians. They couldn't go into the stores and buy. Just having a really hard time. And the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not. You know, Jesus gave this church a name. He called them a synagogue of Satan. So the word synagogue is just like we would call church today. And so I could say there are churches of Christ that we might drive by and we might say, oh, there's a church of Christ. There's another church of Christ worships there. And Jesus, if he was driving by, what would he say? He would say, there's a synagogue of Satan. Is that unbelievable that we could fall under that same condemnation? See, if we're going to be the kind of church that Jesus wants us to be, the kind of church that he can commend, then we must be experiencing this type of tribulation, this type of suffering, the suffering that comes about when somebody says something really bad to you and you say, I'm sorry, please forgive me. I didn't mean to offend you. And instead of defending yourself, instead of getting on your high hobby horse and having a pity party and saying, woe is me, I'm really struggling, we need to be able to be commended for suffering, and we will not be commended for suffering unless we live the resume that Jacoby spoke about in Matthew chapter 5, right? That's a pretty impressive resume. That's what he wants us. Now, you live that, you will suffer, I guarantee you. The type of suffering that he wants us to suffer, not necessarily being fed to the lions, but because you're a witness. Now, let me ask you another question. If we are Christians only in this building, and we never talk about our faith outside the walls of this building, would we be able to suffer this way? Let me put it differently. Would we be able to get this kind of commendation? In June, I would like to talk to you also about the faithful church of Philadelphia, because we're looking in June about what it means to be faithful. But I think it begins here with us at our very core saying, you know what? I've got to be Jesus. I must be an example. Again, witness, martyr is example. Are you an example of faith? All the Guins had to do on the mission field is just be Christ, right? You just had to be Christ. That's all Christ wants you to do. Just behave like Christ would, and then you will have the commendation. You will have this happen to you. Part of what I did was looking at the catacombs. Just outside of Rome, 600 miles of tunnels, as this church literally was forced to go underground. During the 300 years of persecution, 300 years of persecution, a minimum of 1.7 million of your brothers and sisters died. Now, some people say, oh, it wasn't really that bad, and it didn't happen that way. Jimmy, if we could choose, would we go and bury you underground in a tunnel, or would we go bury you in a normal place, right? I mean, you can go and count the skeletons. There's skulls, there are bones, ligaments, just walls just made up of bones in those catacombs. I tried to choose ones that wouldn't scare you. It's really, really bad. The realistic number is probably 4.5 million people. Christians died over 300 years being buried. If they had a burial service in the open, people automatically knew that they were Christians, because only Christians would put each other in the ground. The others they would burn or they would do whatever. They wouldn't bury you in the ground. Christians did. And so they were persecuted. You can see that word, Jesus Christ, God's Son and Savior. Ichthus is the Greek word for fish. On the bottom over here, the S, it looks like a C, but it's not. There's a little thing that goes down. When it's at the end of a sentence, that's how you make an S. Otherwise, it's just a circle with a stripe hanging over if it's in the middle. But that is what was written all over those catacombs. Also, there were crosses, and the crosses were changed with an artistic effect, Jack, and it was changed into an anchor. And we sing a song, Anchor of Our Soul, Anchor for Our Soul. Sang it this week at one of the services that I was part of. When I talk about faithfulness, when I talk about our testimony, and I think about those catacombs, and I think about how many millions of our brothers and sisters died, it's unbelievable. What is the biggest city in America? It's New York, 8-point-something million. The second biggest is Los Angeles, 3.8 million. Probably more people were killed, Christians were killed, than the entire population of the inner Los Angeles city. Does that put some perspective on it? Can it become real to you? Can you understand what happened? We're talking about being faithful unto death. And all Jesus is asking for, because the blood of the martyrs paved the way for us, all we have to do is just be Christians. I sometimes say just be nice, because that's what being a Christian is. And so we need to, first of all, to be faithful unto death, we have to have that kind of commendation. Secondly, we need to receive, in verse 10, this type of counsel. And this is really hard, to receive this counsel. Do not fear. Do not fear what I'm about to tell you. Jesus, you're about to go to the cross. Do not fear that you're about to go to the cross. Jesus needed to get to that point before the cross. And He needs you and I to get to that point. We look at the world and we realize that today, because of Christianity, people are being martyred. Again, I was thinking, what could I show you of martyrdom? And I couldn't. There was one lady I saw in Africa that had been burned. Her whole face was disfigured. And you would think that she would be bitter, but she was filled with joy and peace. She had the most beautiful smile. And not because her lips were burned off, they weren't. It's just a smile radiating from her face. That's what we're talking about. It could happen. It could happen. We've seen things the way the world is going. We realize there's going to be a time when tax-exempt status won't even be on the table. It will be, you're going to be taxed because you're a Christian. You're going to be persecuted because you're a Christian. If it's happening all over the world, why will it not eventually come here? Do not fear what you are about to suffer. How about that? I'm telling you, you're about to suffer something really bad, and I don't want you to fear. How many of you can receive that counsel? Is that easy? Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold the evil one. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison. Why? That you may be tested. For 10 days you're going to be tested. You'll be in tribulation, 10 being a perfect number. And again, prison is not necessarily prison. It could be, behold, your head's going to be chopped off. Behold, you're going to become a Roman candle. You all know what a Roman candle is? For those of you who don't know, I'm not going to tell you. It's awful. Behold, the lions are going to eat you. Behold, you're going to be shipwrecked. Behold, you're going to be crucified. Behold, you're going to be beaten with 40 lashes minus one. No. That's awful things. And some of them were cast into prison, and then they came out of prison after spending many years in prison only to be killed. And I don't want you to be afraid. See, perfect love casts out all fear. Christians don't fear. We don't fear. Take fear to its ultimate point. Think about what is the worst anybody can do to you. If you're born again, you've died with Christ, you've resurrected with Christ, you are commended because of your witness for Christ. Now you're receiving the counsel, do not fear. Can you? What's the worst anyone can do to you? Send you home, right? I mean, that's about it. I can try to make you afraid, but really, if you think about it, what can make you afraid? For 10 days, that's just a perfect number. God knows how much. I think about those people escaping with their lives, escaping fire. And I think about 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 15. Some of you will be saved, yet as one escaping the flames of fire. And for many Christians, that was real. And today, it is real. Christians today are being burned. Today, their heads are being chopped off. Today, they're being beaten. Today, they're being put into prison. The voice of the martyrs today is strong. And the voice of the martyrs should never be silenced. You look at Revelation chapter 6, verse 9 and 10, you'll see those souls who had been beheaded, who had been martyred. They're under the altar and they're crying out, how long will you take before you avenge our blood? They remember, they know the person that did this to them. They know what emperor it was or who the person, and they're saying, when is it going to happen? That you may be tested, for 10 days you will suffer tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and you will receive a crown of righteousness. Be faithful unto death. What does that mean to you, to be faithful unto death? One of the great wonders of the world is in Rome. It's a big, huge Colosseum. The architect of the Colosseum was drafted, and around about 87 they started, 72 they finished this incredible building. The story goes that he was asked to come to this grand opening. And as he was there, and the Emperor Flavius was presenting him to the world, saying, we need to honor this man, for what he's done. And we're going to do that by bringing out the wild animals and feeding 2 Christians to these wild animals. And everybody got so excited, except the architect. He immediately said, but I'm a Christian. When they took him, they threw him down. By the time his body hit the bottom, it was all bruised and bloodied up, and he was dead. Would you stand up? Would you stand up if it was you? Do not fear. This world is not what it is all about. There's something so much better that we're going to. Nobody can take that away from you. Receive the counsel, receive the commendation, but receive the counsel. And now, can you receive the challenge? Verse 11. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear. Do you have an ear to hear? Can you listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches? This is what he's saying. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. Do you believe that, Christian? The one who conquers. What does that mean to conquer? Keep your witness. Keep your example. Be nice. Turn the other cheek. Don't be angry with your brother. Don't get caught up in lust. Don't take each other to court. I mean, just look at the resume. There's so few points in Matthew chapter 5 to be perfect like he wants you to be perfect. Do that. Receive the commendation. Receive the counsel. Do it without fear. Oh, terrible things happen in our lives. This week I can easily think about 2 times that I received something that wasn't pleasant. Oh, I didn't talk about it. The devil probably wanted me to talk about it. I kept my mouth real quiet about it. I let it stop right there and took it on the chin. That's the way we need to do it. Receive the counsel and then receive this challenge. Be faithful unto death, you will conquer. And if you conquer, you will not be hurt by a second death. What is a second death? The second death is this. I experienced my first death when I died with Christ. My second death is going to be when I physically leave this world. It can't hurt me. The second death for many who have not been born again, or for everybody who's not been born again, is going to be, their first death is going to be when they leave this world. Their second death is described in Revelation very accurately as when you are cast into the fire of hell with Satan and his angels. That will be the second death. Now, to us, that second death can't have anything to do with us. It can't harm us. All we have is a victory party. We get given a crown of life. Well done, good and faithful servant. That's what is in our future. That's what we want. We don't want the other stuff. We want the good stuff. And so if you haven't been baptized and you haven't experienced the first death, then for you, the second death is very real. If you're in an age of accountability and you know what you ought to do and you're not doing it, you are in jeopardy. You are running a risk of something really, really bad. Polycarp was an elder in the church in Smyrna. He knew John the Apostle before he died. He was just a young man. They say of Polycarp, this is one of the rumors of Polycarp, when Jesus took the little children and put the little children in his lap, that Polycarp was that little child. And that he went from Jerusalem to Antioch and then to Smyrna. And at Smyrna, he became one of the elders at Smyrna. The tradition even says that John the Apostle had something to do with steering him in that direction. But finally, around about AD 60, there are 3 possible dates. AD 60 being the earliest one. He was taken because of his faith. He was tied to a tree. Grass was put around him, and he was set on fire, but the flames wouldn't burn him, it is said. So somebody ran him through. It's as if one of these trees, Robin, that you cut down over here is taken with a big moving equipment. A big hole is made in our parking lot and it's shoved in there, and one of our 2 elders is taken and burned there. That will have a tremendous impact, not just on us, but on the church for all eternity. We will remember it, and so we do. It's horrible when people have to die those kinds of deaths. These are some of the last words of people who died. Henry Foss, just before being martyred, Henry Foss said, "If I had twin heads, they should all be off for Christ." If I had twin heads, they would all be off for Christ. Castillo Rupia said, "Though you throw my body down off this steep hill, yet will my soul mount upwards again." Isn't that great? You're going to throw me down, but my soul's going to go up. John Boisson said, "I shall have double jail delivery. Out of my sinful flesh and out of the lonesome dungeon I have long lain in." Does he sound miserable? Does he sound depressed? He's been in this jail for all this time. He's about to be led to his death, and he says, I'm going to have a double victory. I'm not only going to get out of that stinking jail, I'm going to go home. See, this is wonderful, folks. Listen to people, your brothers and sisters, the moments before they died. Taylor said, now I lack but 2 steps, and I'm at my Father's house. Wow. Carpenter said, all Bavaria is not as dear to me as my wife and children, but for Christ's sake, I gladly forsake all. When I ask you to be faithful to death, I remember the time I stood here in front of a church, and I promised that I would be faithful unto death to my wife. And I think, wow, to even compare that to the Christian journey since that time. Unbelievable. There are Christians really suffering. I was wondering about Ben this Friday. He had a debate with somebody who had been in this religious world for a long time on the book of Revelation. And that's not even suffering. This, what we see here, that really happened. It's so unbelievably disgusting. But it happened. And so the invitation today is a very solemn one. It's trying to let you understand it's all about the blood. It's about the blood of Jesus who died, who could tell us what we have today. It's about you saying, I haven't had that blood yet. I've seen my parents doing it. I've seen my uncles, my aunts, my brothers, my sisters. But I haven't done it. I have to do it. I don't know what your future lays, but I know that if you've chosen the Christian path, there's definitely persecution in your future. And you may need strength today. You may have really suffered this past week. Please come for the prayers of the church. If you need to be baptized or you need consolation of the prayers of this church, whatever your need is, please come forward right now as together we stand and sing.